Now let's take a look what happens if you create a bottleneck for your enemies to pass through. So in this case there are only two enemies, well obviously there are gonna be possibly more, but they are represented by two enemies which are pretty weak enemies. They're starter enemies, maybe even first wave enemies, but for sure early game enemies. They don't have too much health, they don't do too much attack damage. Of course, due to the bottleneck they're in really exposed position when turrets from both sides can shoot them as well as the player. Thus, obviously they're gonna have a pretty hard time pushing through the base. And due to being only starter enemies, they're very likely going to be absolutely demolished. And as you see, the first enemy is already the only one left, and this final one is just getting finished off by the trio of attacking, and it's done. So let's see what happens if you have stronger enemies in this bottleneck. So in this case we have a third enemy which we consider pretty strong enemy, fairly strong enemy, let's say a bit of a mid-game enemy that has more health, more attack damage. Yeah, obviously I think the most important part, it has more health because you can soak up more damage, but also better attack damage. So now obviously the enemies are gonna get shot in the same choke point, same bottleneck, and the player is gonna be forced to move back to the enemies being a bit stronger, and yeah, while some of them are gonna get killed, they're gonna be able to push deeper and deeper. Eventually the player is gonna be forced off to the side, so to dodge, and then the enemies are gonna breach through further into the base. The turrets are shooting them, but due to them being a bit stronger, they survive. Now only the strong enemy remains, but it's getting out of reach of the second turret, and it's running away from the player towards the blue square, which is the core. The player is moving towards the enemy and shooting it, as well as the turret, but the other turret unfortunately cannot reach anymore because it's out of range. The player doesn't have too strong of a gun, but due to the help of also the turret, this enemy is potentially gonna be defeated and not attack the core. So what is gonna happen if there are no gaps for your enemies to pass? In this case we have the whole place filled with gates and a turret is blocking the way. Due to the turret having lower health than the walls, the enemies are gonna pile onto the turret and start attacking them. Even though that the player and the other turret is shooting at them, they're much stronger than a turret on its own, thus they're gonna be able to breach through and start going for the core. The player is shooting them, the turret is shooting them, but the enemies have already overrun the base and soon can get out of the range of the second turret and start attacking the core. Obviously the player doesn't have a strong enough gun to deal with 3 enemies, thus it's gonna be really hard for him to deal with it. And once all the enemies are attacking the core, or at least a bunch of them, then the core is doomed to explode. What if there isn't a gap for your enemies to pass? Part 2. In this case we have only walls blocking the way to the core. Then the enemies are gonna see that the quickest way to get to the core is to destroy this wall. So they're all gonna pile onto the wall and attack it. The wall does however have more health than a turret, so they're gonna take more soak damage. But eventually, obviously, if they're strong enough, they're gonna be able to destroy the wall. Once they destroy the wall, again they have quick access towards the core. And while they're getting shot, they've overwhelmed the core, and thus the core is gonna eventually explode. And game over.